Last video, we look at the macroeconomist model, and we are focusing on, okay, so being a macroeconomist or government who are trying to keep track on the healthy level of the macroeconomy. So how can they measure it? So generally speaking, we have five things they need to measure: output, jobs, price, growth, international balances. And they also has to understand what will affect these five outcomes. And we talk about internal market force, external shocks, and the policy levers, if you believe in Keynes theory, who proposing the government intervention. But at this point, you can see there is this determinant and outcomes, they are not connected, because any internal market force changes or external shocks or policy levers. So how will that affect our output, jobs, price, growth, international balance? So at this point, we don't know yet. So that's why from now we are starting to study the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So how this works, because any determinant will affect aggregate demand and the aggregate supply, which in turn will show in the changes in the macroeconomic outcomes. So that's why it's very, very important to know how the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply works and what are they. So any influence on macro outcomes must be transmitted through supply or demand. So the macro model show how the macro economy works, and it consists of the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. So it's very similar as supply and demand. When we're looking at the market price, it's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from the interaction between the consumer and the supplier by moving around their supply and demand curve, and we can figure out how much the market should supply and what is the market price for a certain product. Very similar idea but different. So keep in mind, don't mix the supply and demand with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So they are similar, but they are totally different. So that's why we're going to look at first, what is aggregate demand? So the aggregate demand is the total quantity of the output, usually measured by the real GDP. And so at the alternative price level in a given time period, ceteris paribus. It sounds like very similar as our demand. That demand is the total quantity demanded at the price given period of time, ceteris paribus. And so the aggregate demand, keep in mind we are looking at the relationship is between real GDP and the price level. So it can be the CPI. So real GDP and the price level. So the real GDP and the price level. So the demand we learn in the chapter 3 and 4, when we talk about individual products demand, it means the products quantity demand and product price. But now we talk about real GDP and the relationship with the price level. So the aggregate demand is the collective behavior of all buyers in the marketplace, and it comprise all goods and the services. So it is, when we talk about aggregate demand, it's not just about you or about your family or just about your neighborhood. Actually, it's about the nation. So all buyers, their behaviors, and also how they will respond the price level change. So it's not just about one product, it's a basket of the products. So generally speaking, the aggregate demand curve looks like a demand curve. So it is slopes downward. So which means the people will buy more goods and the services at the lower price level and vice versa. So it's really very similar as our law of the demand. But we are talking about all people, they will buy more goods, and when the price level is lower, it's not just a price. So the average of the basket price will lower. So the average demand curve, it look like that. Yes, it's really like our demand curve, but this is what I want to emphasize. Why this is the curve go downward. So you cannot using the idea you learn from the individual demand curve to explain why the aggregate demand curve is going downward, but actually you should through your macro point of view to interpret why it's a downward curve. So there are three reasons why this aggregate demand curve is downward. So the first is real balance effect. The second is a foreign trade effect. And the third is interest rate effect. So first of all, think about real balance effect. So think about when the price level goes down. So what does that mean? So keep in mind, when the price level goes down, let's say you always earn $1,000, but the value of $1,000 goes up because the price level goes down, which means before $1,000 you only can, for instance, you buy 1,000 burgers, so $1 per piece. So now since the price level goes down, so the per burger dropped to 50 cents. So now you actually, although you only have $1,000 monthly, now since the price level goes down, you can buy 2,000 burgers, right? So that is called the real balance effect. So because the price level goes down, it's indicating the real value of the money, your income, is measured by how many goods and the service your money will buy. Since the price value goes down, and the value of your income become more valuable, and you can buy more products, so the cash balance you hold will purchase more goods and the services if the price level falls, and the fewer goods and the services if the price level rise. So that's why you can see this downward curve is really because the price level goes down means the price of the product goes down, but your income still be the same given the same amount of income you have, but now you can buy more goods. So that's why the price level goes down. You can afford to buy more products. So that's why you can see this downward curve. So this explanation is called the real balance effect. Real balance effect. And also the second effect also cause the downward aggregate demand. We call the foreign trade effect. So the foreign trade effect is also looking at the price level. So when the price level goes down, think about it. So compare domestic product and a foreign product. If your domestic price level goes down, that means the product produced domestically get cheaper. So if you're the consumer in the U.S., the product produced in the U.S. get cheaper, and will you buy more foreign product or domestic product? Yes, you are right. So you will buy more domestic produced product because the price level goes down means the domestic produced goods are cheaper than the foreign goods. So as we talk about the aggregate demand, is measure the real output or real GDP. So the real GDP is measured by the product, including the product produced in the domestic market. So which means compared to the foreign goods, you can buy more domestic goods, so your real GDP should goes up. So that's another reason why the aggregate demand is downward, because as the price level goes down, the domestic produced products will get cheaper, and then you can afford more domestic goods. That's why the real GDP will goes up, because you can buy more domestic produced goods. So that's the second reason we call it a foreign trade effect. It's looking at the relative price between foreign goods and the domestic produced goods. And the third reason why the aggregate demand is downward is called a real rate interest rate effect. Interest rate effect. So since the price level goes down, and that means the consumer has to borrow less, right? Because you already uh, has the price already go down. You have certain amount of income never change, so you can buy more product, or you can afford to buy used to be expensive product. So the consumer need to borrow less. So the demand for loans actually diminished because the dollar value increased, and so your demand for loan diminished. So the interest will drop. So the reverse is true when the price rise. So that's how to use the interest rate effect to interpret the downward aggregate demand. Keep in mind, when the price level drop, consumer don't need a lot of loans, and since loan diminishing, and the interest rate will drop. So to summarize what I mentioned, so the real balance is talk about the cash you hold is worth more when the price level falls, so you can buy more. So the foreign trade effect is lower price level in the United States, convince consumer to buy more American goods and fewer foreign goods, so that will drive the real GDP up. And the interest rate effect is lower interest rate promote more borrowing and more spending.